Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So today is going to be a highly atypical Inbetweenisode, and it's about a topic that has been much demanded, and I have felt unqualified to talk about it, and frankly, I still feel unqualified to talk about it, but I have an excuse to talk about it anyways, because a guy named Arby sent me some of this water recipe, water concentrate that he has, Truth Serum. Him and I believe Max over at Tea Secrets and Arby at Empirical Tea developed a sort of water recipe. And if you want to get all into the chemicals and all of that nitty gritty science stuff, you can definitely head over to both of their blogs, really. They're both definitely worth checking out and reading about it. Both are up to some really interesting things, and it's fun to see where some of the tea energy and where people are taking their just sort of experiments these days, and I'm glad to see that sort of experimentation. From myself, I don't necessarily have that same sort of energy to devote to something right now, so it's good to see it, and it's also good to see that really focus on certain aspects of it. Arby in particular is focusing a lot on storage as well, so some really interesting storage experiments with heat, so using some very, very extreme heat conditions and things like that, seeing how long it takes for stuff to mold. So definitely check both of those out. I'll put those both into the show notes, the description below, if you are interested in if either of those things sounds interesting to you. Max also has a very interesting site, Tea Secrets, where I think a lot of the focus is also on water. Both of them, understandably, are focusing on water. And he actually, I was just looking at one of his posts where he gives a tea rating and the water rating, and I think the idea is sort of like that the water, seeing how well the water performs on certain teas. The idea being that maybe certain waters or certain water recipes are more well suited towards different circumstances, different teas, different locations, bringing out different things to the forefront. So hopefully I am not misspeaking at all. I do feel a little bit out of my depths in talking about this stuff because frankly I haven't done a ton of experiments on this, but I have some of their Truth Serum. I am going to boil it, and I'm going to try a couple different teas. I was messing around with it a little bit earlier today, and it's interesting. I drank it straight. This is a concentrate, so what you do is you take 1 part of this and 9 parts of distilled water. So I actually tried it, just drinking it side by side with tap water, which is what I use for most of it. And we do have very specific, a specific sort of water here, the Pacific Northwest. It's very soft. The TDS in my TDS meter usually reads between 30 and 35, which is pretty unusual, I think, for most of the U.S. where you're dealing with harder water. So when I compared those two side by side, definitely some pretty obvious differences. The Truth Serum was definitely heavier, a little harder. Probably, I don't know if it's just because I'm unfamiliar with it, but a little more complex. So pretty interesting, just on the get-go on that. And when I tried it on teas, there was also some interesting differences. For some teas, I'm not sure which one, frankly, I preferred. But for one of the teas here, and I tried it on a raw pour, a traditionally stored raw pour, and some oolong. And for the oolong in particular, it really brought out a lot of vibrancy, a lot of texture to it. So I'm going to do a couple more steeps on the oolong and maybe 1 steep on this traditionally stored raw pour, just to see how they do. So let's get going. Okay, so I have I think steep number 4 or 5 and steep number 5 or 6 here. And I have another steep going here. I just heated up while the water was hot. And before I forget, I also wanted to shout out an episode they did with Glenn on Between Two Teapots. If you're interested in about an hour and a half interview with the two of them together, check that out. It's really interesting. They cover a lot of those topics in far more depth than I could. In fact, Glenn is probably dealing with fairly similar water to the stuff that I have here, just being in Linwood, which is just a little bit north of Seattle. So check that out too. If this is up your alley, I think they'll go in far more depth than I could do here. So here, let's go. So the tea here is Tea Home Legend of Dongding. It's a relatively inexpensive tea. For me, this tea is kind of a daily drinker. It's nothing crazy, but it's a good tea for the price. Has a basic roasted oolong profile. I brought it on to at least one. I think I brought it on twice on Inbetweenisode. So cheers. So I think this is a tea I know pretty well. Brought it on, and I think this tea, the water recipe is having a particularly strong and I think pretty good impact on this one. The body feels much thicker. I think there's more texture to it as well, and there's just a little more vibrancy to it. This tea, for the most part, it just tastes more impressive than it does normally. And I don't know that it's making much of an impact on the aroma or in terms of like Huigan and stuff like that. We'll have to see. I mean, I guess the aftertaste is something you'll need to evaluate a little bit later. Gonna do another brew while this water is still hot here. Cheers. Wow. Yeah. No. Making a big difference. This is just much thicker, much richer. I think there's a little bit extra sharpness to it as well. It's just a much heavier feeling tea. This tea for me rarely gives me sort of that intensity and that stuff going on. So I'm definitely liking this tea a bit more. My verdict for the other two teas that I was having was a little more mixed. It definitely made some impact. It's less clear if it's a total upgrade for the more dry stored raw pour, which unfortunately I did pretty much brew out with this, or this tea. In fact, there's a thickness that just really sticks in your mouth for this too, that I don't think is coming necessarily from the tea. Yeah, it's not as sweet too. Interesting. Still kind of has like this acorn nuttiness that I sometimes get for this tea. Really interesting. Yeah, so I would normally pour straight into the cup, but because we are trying to get through some brews here, gonna go into here. They also talked about sort of the aeration of the tea and all that fun stuff during it. Yeah, a lot of information covered in that Between Two Teapots, so definitely recommend you check that out. This tea is pretty close to brewed out now, if I'm to judge from the aroma. And let's brew this as well. We're going to be lazy and just brew here. So this is a 2009 Yiwu ripe pour. Not really that great, but it's a good example of dank, and it sort of fits into a different category than this tea. It's all lower register stuff, as you would expect from a traditionally stored tea. So I'm curious if that sort of like vibrancy and stuff like that translates real well to this too. I know also that Sue, we brought on a couple of her teas from her collection in the past, recommends low TDS water for more aged tea. This tea is not really an aged tea per se, but it has a lot of those lower register notes that you'd expect from traditionally stored. So I think it might be an appropriate surrogate for a more aged example. So we'll see how that is as well. Yeah, so I give that a pretty good brew just because I've been brewing this a little bit throughout the day. Cheers. So the tea's top notes are falling off, as one might expect from a tea that we're on infusion 6 or 7 of. But it's maintaining like this really heaviness to it. And it gives it a fair bit more complexity. So I'd be curious to hear of the people watching this video, how many of you have experimented with water? How is your local water? Arby and Max really look at some like the chemicals of it and like the alkaline ratio with something, which just frankly just goes a fair amount over my head personally, but I'd be curious if anyone else has looked at that. For me, I'm just a dummy that likes to taste tea and talk about it. This is really sort of expanding my horizons. Frankly, the water stuff is one big reason that I haven't been into it. It's very overwhelming. Cheers. Interesting. So it's very clear it's changing this tea. Is it changing it for the better? I'm not sure. I think given how I brew, that's probably not the case. Could I adjust my brewing eventually to sort of suit this better? Probably. But this brew is pretty bitter. It's pretty sharp. It has that same sort of bass and vibrancy to it that the Dongding does, but I'm not sure that it's really improving the tea, this tea, as much as it does this. And that's not a knock on the water necessarily. This water, I believe, was at least one of the reasons it was designed was just to extract more from the tea, and in some cases maybe extracting more of the sharpness and the vibrancy of it can be sort of a negative when it comes to a tea that you want to be a little more on the smooth side, like a traditionally stored pu'er. Ooh, yeah, that's a pretty rough brew, honestly, and it's possible I overbrewed it, but it was brewing about this color earlier, so not loving that one. So results can really vary. This sort of brew is not an uncommon one for me, and the amount of intensity and complexity and intenseness. Well, I said that already. Is just very, very strong for this one. So that one for me, not my favorite, for sure. So let me know, have you experimented with water? I think this is probably something where Arby has sent me enough that I'll try Denny with this, and we'll see how he likes the water. We'll maybe do a side-by-side test. I was originally going to do a side test with this, but decided I'd just kind of talk more generally about it, do some casual experiments. So I apologize, this is not like the most sound experimentation method. I'm burning the same chai, I'm drinking out of the same cups, I'm not doing a proper blind test or whatever, but I still think there's some value in this. So takeaways, the water is definitely different. I think it's an area probably worth experimentation. It's one of the key components to tea, of course. Frankly, it's a relatively unexplored part. So I'm happy to see people like Max and Arby doing those experiments. So thank you to both. Check out both of their sites. Thank you, Arby, especially for sending me the Truth Serum. Been a really interesting try, and I will hope to feature it at some point with Denny as well. So thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time.